Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah,
And today we're going to be going into a case that's both shocking and incredibly complex.
absolutely.
The story of Luis Garavito, the Colombian serial killer.
Yeah.
And you've sent us a ton of information on this case. YouTube videos, Wikipedia articles, even some scientific publications.
It's an amazing set of material, and it's super disturbing, but really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the first things that really grabbed my attention was just the sheer scale of his crimes.
Yeah.
He confessed to murdering over 140 boys, but investigators believe the actual number could be well over 300, possibly even closer to 400.
Yeah, that potential 400 number is what makes him possibly one of the most prolific serial killers in history. And I think to really understand that, you really need to grasp the context.
Yeah.
This is Colombia in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
A nation dealing with a brutal civil war, tons of poverty, the power of drug cartels.
And all of that basically created this whole underclass of street children that were called disposables.
Yeah, neglected, often orphaned, pretty much invisible to society.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad.
Yeah, and one thing that came up in the sources that really just stuck with me
Yeah.
was that Garavito would often lead his victims past the bodies of previous victims on the way to their deaths.
It's
You can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's a detail that makes my stomach churn just even thinking about it.
Yeah, it really shows you the dehumanization that was going on.
Yeah.
He wasn't seeing them as humans, just as objects to be used and discarded.
So let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about Garavito's background.
Okay.
What can we learn about his childhood?
Well, the research paints a really horrific picture. Lots of abuse, neglect. His father was a violent alcoholic.
Okay.
And it's even been suggested that he was physically and even possibly sexually abusive towards Lewis.
And this is a pattern that we see repeated so often with serial killers.
Yeah, but it's really important to emphasize
Of course.
that traumatic childhood is not an excuse.
Right.
It's a factor, not a justification.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that really struck me as I was going through all this material was this apparent contradiction.
Okay.
Garavito was deeply religious, a devout Pentecostal,
Yeah.
yet he committed these heinous acts. How is that even possible?
It's a question that a lot of people who've studied the case have really struggled with.
Yeah.
Garavito would constantly seek forgiveness for his sins, but at the same time, he was fascinated by figures like Hitler, seeing his crimes as some sort of twisted form of cleansing society.
It's like he compartmentalized those two parts of himself.
Yeah.
The devout believer and the ruthless killer.
Yeah, and this compartmentalization, this cognitive dissonance, isn't uncommon in people with antisocial personality disorder, which Garavito was diagnosed with.
Right.
You know, they can hold these completely different conflicting beliefs
Yeah.
and compartmentalize their actions in a way that lets them function, however horrifically.
Okay, so we've got this background of abuse, possible mental illness, and this strange mix of religious fervor and fascination with figures like Hitler.
Yeah.
What else contributed to his descent into violence?
The sources make it clear that alcohol played a major role.
Okay.
He was almost always heavily intoxicated when he committed these crimes.
So alcohol basically fueled his violent tendencies?
Yeah, and, alcohol lowers inhibitions, fuels aggression, impairs judgment, really a powerful catalyst for violence.
It's like adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly.
So for years, he was able to operate undetected,
Right.
preying on these vulnerable children. How was he finally caught?
So it was a combination of good police work and really just dumb luck. People were becoming more aware of the missing children.
Yeah.
Investigators were starting to connect the dots, but the break came when Garavito accidentally set a sugarcane field on fire while passed out drunk next to the bodies of his victims.
Oh, wow.
So he pretty much left a trail of breadcrumbs right back to himself.
So he left all this evidence that would seal his fate.
Yeah, and he left behind what they call his black bag,
Oh, right.
which was essentially his toolkit for his crimes.
Yeah.
Inside, they found journals with details of his actions,
Wow.
photos of his victims, even like tallies of the lives he had taken.
It's just like something out of a nightmare.
Yeah, just a chilling reminder of the darkness that can live in a human.
So what was the legal outcome?
So he was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison, which was the longest sentence ever given in Colombia.
So that sounds like he's locked up for good, case closed.
Not quite. You see, because of a weird quirk in Colombian law, he might be eligible for parole as early as 2023.
Wait, hold on. He could actually walk free after all of that.
Yes, and As you can imagine, that's caused a lot of public outcry.
Yeah.
In Colombia, a lot of people think that a man who committed such atrocities should never see the light of day again.
So we're left with this unsettling question then.
Yeah.
What does it say about society, about our justice system, that a man like this could not only exist but thrive for so long?
It makes you think about the darkness within individuals,
Right.
but also the failures of society that allow that darkness to succeed.
Now, before we get more into that,
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back and look at the investigation itself.
Okay.
Because unraveling a case like this with so many victims
Right.
must have been a massive undertaking.
Absolutely. I mean, the discovery of the mass graves
Yeah.
containing bodies of dozens of young boys sent shockwaves through Colombia and really the world.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom.
And the horrific state they were found in, signs of torture, mutilation, unimaginable cruelty, just added to the horror.
I remember reading in one of the sources that Garavito would
Yeah.
relish the terror he inflicted and even force some of his victims to walk past the bodies of those he'd already killed.
It's disturbing, but I think details like that are
Yeah.
really crucial to understanding the depravity.
Right.
It really highlights the sadistic pleasure that he got from inflicting this pain.
And it's even more disturbing that his crimes went unnoticed for years.
And this goes back to the societal context.
Yeah.
These were street children, disposables as they were called, so their disappearances didn't cause as much alarm
Right.
as if they'd been from more affluent families.
It's a heartbreaking reality, but it's true.
Yeah, the case really shows those inequalities, the systemic failures that let him operate for so long.
So we've touched on the scale of his crimes, his horrific childhood,
Right,
and that societal context.
right.
But I want to dig more into Garavito's psychology.
Okay.
Several of the sources mention this fascination with Hitler
Yeah.
and this kind of twisted worldview.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating part of the case.
Yeah.
Garavito seemed to really admire Hitler's ruthlessness and power.
Okay.
He even collected Nazi memorabilia.
Wow.
And he expressed this pride in the efficiency of his own killings.
It's just mind-boggling that someone could be so detached
It is.
from the suffering that they're inflicting.
Yeah.
Didn't the sources also mention that he had a history of mental illness?
Yeah, there's records of him being diagnosed with depression, psychosis, and he even attempted suicide at one point.
Oh, okay.
And while mental illness certainly doesn't excuse his actions,
Right.
it does provide a small look into his psyche.
Yeah. And there were accounts of him experiencing guilt and shame, especially when he was sober.
That's true.
Yeah. But Dr. Mark Benek, the forensic psychologist that interviewed him, described those feelings more as self-preservation
Really?
than actual remorse.
Wow, so even his displays of guilt could have been manipulation.
Yeah, Benek described him as a textbook psychopath,
Wow.
highly skilled at manipulating others and presenting a normal facade.
Yeah, right.
But behind that was a very disturbed and dangerous person.
And we can't forget, he was deeply religious,
Right.
which adds another layer to his psychological profile.
Absolutely. He saw himself as this devout Pentecostal
Mm-hmm.
seeking forgiveness for his sins while committing these horrific acts.
Yeah, it's hard to understand.
It really shows the human capacity for self-deception.
And how we can rationalize even the most awful things.
He even claimed to have made a pact with the devil
He did.
that Satan commanded him to kill.
Yeah, just showing how warped his worldview was.
It seems like in Garavito's case, evil wasn't this black and white thing.
It wasn't.
It was more nuanced and even more disturbing.
Exactly. He wasn't this monster lurking in the shadows.
Right.
He held down jobs, had relationships, even went to church,
Right.
but still capable of this incredible cruelty.
One detail that really stuck with me from the research was his habit of collecting trophies
Oh, yeah.
from his victims.
He kept photos, ID cards, even clothing of the boys he murdered.
It's just this chilling reminder of the possessive and dehumanizing nature of his crimes.
They're reminders of his power, his control over the victims,
Right.
letting him relive his crimes and maintain control long after the act itself.
That's terrifying. It's like he wanted to build a shrine to his own depravity.
And that need to document and preserve is something we see in many serial killers. And it speaks to their deep-seated need for validation,
Yeah.
to leave their mark on the world.
However twisted and horrifying.
Exactly.
So let's talk about his modus operandi.
Okay.
Was there a pattern to how he selected and approached his victims?
Oh, absolutely. Garavito had a very clear method.
Okay.
He targeted street children, those who were vulnerable,
Right.
often overlooked by society.
Yeah.
He'd lure them with promises of money, sweets, odd jobs,
Okay.
using his charisma and kindness to gain their trust.
It's like he was a master manipulator, preying on their innocence of desperation.
Yeah, once he got them alone, he would walk them for long distances,
Wow.
tiring them out and leading them to secluded areas.
So he was planning these crimes very carefully.
Very meticulously.
Wow.
Choosing places where he could operate undisturbed.
Yeah.
And dispose of the bodies with minimal risk.
And that calculated approach, coupled with the limited technology available at the time,
Right.
must have made it so difficult to track him.
Oh, absolutely. The lack of a central database for missing kids and just the general chaos in Colombia at the time all played a role in how he was able to evade capture for so long.
So it's like so many factors aligned to create the perfect storm for Garavito to thrive in.
Tragically, yes, it really was.
Okay, so we've talked about the societal context, the investigation, and we've delved into his disturbing psychology.
Yeah.
But now, let's circle back to the issue that's been hanging over our heads, his potential parole.
Okay.
It's a complex issue that I know has divided public opinion in Colombia.
It has. There are those who think he served his time,
Okay.
that everyone deserves a second chance, and that the justice system should be focused on rehabilitation.
And that's a valid point. It's hard to argue with the idea of rehabilitation.
It is.
But then there's the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
Those who believe that a man who committed such horrible acts should never be allowed to walk free.
Yeah.
They say he's a danger to society, and it would be a travesty of justice.
Right. And I can see their point.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, the victims' families must be living with constant fear.
Absolutely. And it's not just them. It's this broader sense of societal anxiety.
Yeah.
Releasing a serial killer back into the community could have terrible consequences.
It really does make you question our justice system, the limits of rehabilitation, and the very nature of evil.
One of the sources you provided described the public outcry.
Yes.
And the protests when his parole became national news.
It really struck a nerve in Colombia.
Yeah.
And that article went on to explain some of the legal technicalities that could lead to him being released.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Something about sentence reductions.
Right. So Colombian law, like many legal systems, has these provisions that let you reduce sentences for good behavior and cooperating with authorities.
Okay.
And Garavito, despite all of this, has reportedly been a model prisoner.
Wow.
He's collaborated with investigators, he's expressed remorse, and he's participated in all these rehab programs.
So he's basically playing the system.
That's one interpretation.
Right.
Some might argue that he's really trying to change to atone for his past.
Right.
But regardless of his motivations, these provisions could lead to his release.
Yeah.
Much to the horror of a lot of Colombians.
It's such a morally complex situation.
It is.
We have this desire for justice.
Right.
This need to see him punished.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this belief in second chances.
Yeah.
This hope that even the worst criminals can be rehabilitated.
It's a tough dilemma with no easy answers.
One of the documentaries featured an interview with a criminal profiler who had studied Garavito.
Yeah.
And she talked about the importance of ongoing monitoring and supervision if he was released.
She did, and she stressed that even if he was granted parole, he would need to be watched closely.
Of course.
To make sure he wasn't a threat.
Right.
She also brought up his age and his health.
Well, he's in his late 60s now.
Late 60s.
And reportedly has eye cancer.
Yeah, so there's a chance he might not even be physically able to commit more crimes.
So there's that possibility, but
even if he was incapable physically,
right,
the mental threat remains.
Yeah.
Those fantasies,
right,
those ingrained patterns of behavior, those don't go away with age.
It really speaks to the challenges of trying to assess risk.
It does.
When we're making these decisions about releasing violent offenders.
And there's no guarantees.
Right.
We can put systems in place, we can monitor, we can evaluate, but there's always a chance
that he could slip through the cracks.
Exactly.
It's scary because if he were to reoffend, the consequences would be devastating.
For everyone involved.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me throughout all of this research was the contrast between his public persona and the nature of his crimes.
Oh, absolutely. And that duality is something you see a lot in these types of cases.
Yeah.
A lot of people said Garavito was charming and charismatic.
Oh.
He could gain the trust of his victims and families very easily.
Yeah.
He was friendly, helpful, even devoutly religious.
Yet underneath all of that was a depraved killer.
Exactly. And that's what's so unsettling about this.
Right.
It challenges our ideas about evil, about how we identify it.
So how do we reconcile that? How do we avoid being fooled by appearances.
One of the articles you sent talked about what they call the mask of sanity,
Oh, yeah, I remember the...
often worn by psychopaths.
Wow.
And it describes how people with antisocial personality disorder can seem charming, intelligent, even trustworthy,
Right.
all while lacking empathy and a moral compass.
Yeah.
They can mimic normal emotions, blend into society,
Right.
which makes them even more dangerous.
Yeah, and for Garavito, that mask of sanity was very effective.
Oh, yeah.
He used it to lure his victims, even befriending families, before betraying their trust.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It can be subtle,
Right.
even disguised as kindness.
So how do we protect ourselves, and more importantly, our children, from predators like him?
It comes down to vigilance, education, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Right.
We need to teach kids about boundaries,
Right?
about the dangers of strangers,
Yeah.
about speaking up when something feels wrong.
Okay.
And we need to be aware of the signs of manipulation, the red flags that someone's not who they seem.
So it's about knowledge and awareness.
Exactly.
We can't live in fear,
Right.
but we can equip ourselves with the tools to recognize potential dangers.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And in this case, it could mean the difference between prevention and tragedy.
Okay, so we've talked about his background, his psychology, societal context, the investigation, and this controversy about his parole.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to shift and talk about the impact of his crimes on Colombian society as a whole.
Yeah, it had a profound impact. It exposed all these social problems and sparked calls for reform.
Wow.
You know, the discovery of the mass graves, the sheer scale of his crimes. Right.
Forced Colombia to confront some uncomfortable truths.
One of the documentaries talked about how his case actually led to new laws
Yeah.
and initiatives to try and protect children and prevent these tragedies.
Yeah, so the Colombian government responded to all this outcry.
Yeah.
They created a centralized database for missing children,
Okay.
increased funding for law enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
and started these public awareness campaigns to try and educate people about child exploitation.
So they took concrete steps
They did.
to address the systemic issues,
They did.
but the scars still run deep, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. You know, many families are still looking for answers.
Yeah.
They're grieving the loss of loved ones.
Right.
The fear and trauma haunts Colombian society.
I read an article
Yeah.
that described the long-term psychological effects.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It talks about PTSD, anxiety, depression, and just this profound sense of loss and insecurity.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the need for continued support and resources to help these people heal and rebuild. So even with positive changes, the healing is ongoing.
Absolutely. Trauma like this just doesn't disappear.
Yeah, it takes time and support.
And a collective effort.
Okay, I want to touch on a topic that's been kind of in the background this whole time. The nature of evil.
The age-old question.
Yeah, what makes someone capable of these acts?
It's a question that's been around forever,
Yeah.
and I don't think there's a simple answer.
Right.
But looking at cases like Garavito's,
Right.
I think we can get some clues, some pieces of the puzzle.
Okay.
You know, we've seen how trauma plays a role.
Right.
The impact of mental illness, the influence of alcohol abuse.
But none of those things fully explain it.
Exactly.
That cruelty, the lack of empathy.
It's where things get really murky.
Yeah.
There's something else going on that we
Ah.
just can't fully explain.
One of the documentaries featured a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Garavito.
Yeah.
And he said Garavito was a classic psychopath.
He did. He went on to describe him as having all those classic psychopathic traits.
Mhm.
You know, superficial charm,
Right.
manipulative,
Right.
a grandiose sense of self-importance, and a complete lack of remorse.
So it's like he was born without a conscience.
It's a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
And he emphasized that psychopathy isn't insanity.
Okay.
Psychopaths are fully aware of what they're doing and the consequences.
Yeah.
They just don't care.
Wow.
They lack that emotional depth, the moral compass,
Right.
and that's what makes them capable of these acts.
Without any guilt or remorse.
Without any guilt or remorse.
And they blend right in
They do.
to society.
Yeah.
So how do we protect ourselves from these people, these wolves in sheep's clothing?
Awareness is key. We need to learn about the signs of psychopathy, the tactics they use,
Right.
and we need to trust our gut.
Yeah.
If someone makes you feel uneasy, if something seems off, don't ignore it.
So it's about balancing trust with healthy skepticism. Okay, let's move on to a topic that's really fascinating to me.
Okay.
The role of the media in the Garavito case.
The media played a really complicated role.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really shaped public perception of the crimes, influenced the investigation, and had to deal with a lot of ethical dilemmas along the way.
One of the documentaries talked about how the initial coverage was kind of muted, maybe because his victims were mostly street children.
Yeah, and that's a really sad reality.
Wonder.
The media doesn't always place the same value on all lives.
It's heartbreaking, but true.
Yeah, influenced by social class and economic status.
But as more bodies were found, the details came out.
Oh, yeah.
The media really ramped up the coverage.
Right, some outlets focused on all the graphic details,
Wow.
publishing photos, speculating on his motives.
And that kind of graphic coverage can be informative, but it also risks exploiting the victims and their families.
You're right, it's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
The media has to inform the public, but they also have to be sensitive to the victims and their families.
And there's also the potential of influencing the investigation.
Yeah.
It was reported that Garavito himself was following the media coverage.
He was. Some sources even suggest that he was fascinated by it,
Really?
that it fed his ego and even influenced how he committed his crimes.
It's like he was playing a game
It is.
with the media.
It is a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about the consequences of coverage.
Yeah, especially with serial killers.
Especially with serial killers.
One article talked about the ethical dilemmas faced by journalists covering the case.
It talked about that balance between the public's right to know
Right.
and protecting the privacy and dignity of the victims and their families.
And it also brought up the potential for media coverage to glorify violence.
Yeah.
Or inspire copycats.
Yeah, it's a fine line between informing people and contributing to the problem.
So how do journalists deal with all of that? How do they report the facts but be sensitive to the victims?
It's something they face every day. There's no easy answers.
Right.
But I think it comes down to responsible reporting,
Okay.
considering the potential consequences of everything they publish.
So being mindful,
Yeah.
not just of the facts,
Not just the facts.
but the human cost of those facts.
Exactly.
Now, the media also played a role in how Garavito himself was portrayed.
Right.
Some made him out to be a monster, a boogeyman,
Mm-hmm.
while others tried to humanize him
Yeah.
by talking about his childhood,
Yeah, his mental illness.
his beliefs.
Yeah, it's a tension you see in these cases.
Yeah.
Do we focus on the monster or try to understand the human?
And is there a danger in humanizing him?
There is.
Does it minimize the suffering?
Yeah, it's a tough balance.
Yeah.
It's important to understand the things that lead to violence,
Of course.
but we also have to hold people accountable
Yeah.
and not minimize the suffering.
So how do we find that balance?
It starts by recognizing that we're all capable of good and bad, and that understanding the darkness doesn't mean there's no need for accountability.
Okay, let's talk about the legal and ethical implications of this case.
Okay.
Because his crimes raised all these questions about sentencing,
Absolutely.
how we treat mentally ill offenders.
Yeah, as we've discussed, he was sentenced to over 1,800 years.
Right. The longest ever in Colombia.
The longest ever.
But then there's this possibility of parole,
Right.
which seems crazy
It does.
given what he did.
It really does.
And that discrepancy between that initial sentence and the possibility of early release is causing a lot of controversy.
It is.
It makes you question the justice system.
It does. It makes you wonder, is it fair? Is it consistent?
One of the documents argue that his sentence was basically a life sentence.
Yeah.
Because it's unlikely he'll get parole,
Mm-hmm.
but just the fact that it's possible has sparked fear
It has.
and anger.
Yeah, it highlights the need for transparency,
Right.
accountability.
Especially with cases like this. And the case also raises questions about how we treat mentally ill offenders.
It does.
We know he had a history of depression,
Yeah.
psychosis,
Mm-hmm.
alcohol abuse.
Right. And while those don't excuse his actions,
Of course.
it does make you question the level of responsibility
Mhm.
and whether he should be judged the same way
Right.
as someone without those issues.
I read a study
Yeah.
that discussed these challenges of balancing punishment
Right.
with rehabilitation
It did.
when it comes to mentally ill offenders.
It argued that mental illness shouldn't excuse criminal behavior,
Okay.
but it should be considered during sentencing and parole.
Okay.
It also emphasized the need for mental health treatment,
Right.
both in prison and after.
So it's about recognizing that mental illness can contribute to crime,
Yeah.
but it doesn't absolve them.
Responsibility.
It doesn't. Okay, let's talk about the victims.
Okay.
Can you tell us about the psychological effects of his crimes?
Yeah, I mean, the trauma went far beyond the physical injuries.
Of course.
It left lasting emotional and psychological scars.
Right.
Many survivors and families
Yeah.
struggled with PTSD, anxiety, depression,
Right.
this feeling of loss and betrayal.
I remember watching some of the interviews with
I
survivors.
know their stories are heartbreaking. They
Yeah.
talked about nightmares,
Yeah.
flashbacks, difficulty trusting people,
Right.
and just this constant sense of fear and vulnerability.
Yeah.
And on top of all that, there's the stigma of sexual abuse,
Right.
which makes it even harder to seek help.
Yeah. One survivor who was 12 when he was attacked
Mm-hmm.
talked about how it just destroyed his sense of safety and innocence.
He talked about this constant fear,
Yeah.
always looking over his shoulder, not able to trust anyone.
It really makes you think about the lasting impact of trauma
It does.
and how it can steal someone's childhood, their security.
Absolutely.
Another survivor
Yeah.
who was kidnapped and held captive for days talked about the torture. Yeah. The beatings, the sexual abuse, the threats.
The constant fear that he'd never see his family again.
It's hard to even listen to these stories.
It is.
But they highlight the impact
Yeah.
of Garavito's crime.
And they show how important continued support is to
Yeah.
help survivors rebuild.
We read a study
Yeah.
that talked about how childhood trauma shapes brain development
It does.
and increases the risk of mental health issues.
Yeah, and that study really highlighted how important early intervention and trauma-informed care is
Yeah.
to help soften the blow of those long-term effects.
Right. So it's not just about addressing the immediate needs.
Yeah.
It's providing ongoing support.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the emotional and psychological impact on the victims.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about forensic science
Okay.
and its role in the Garavito case.
Yeah, forensic science was crucial in identifying him, connecting him to the crimes,
Right.
and ultimately bringing him to justice.
One of the key pieces of evidence was his black bag.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what was in that bag
Oh, of course.
and why it was so important to the investigation?
That bag was just full of evidence.
Okay.
It had journals with details about his crimes,
Right.
photographs of his victims,
Right.
and even tallies of the lives he'd taken.
It's like he was keeping this record of his own evil.
Yeah, it's horrifying.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating from a forensic point of view.
Right.
It gave investigators this look into his mind
Right.
and really helped them understand his behavior.
Okay, and in addition to the journals and photographs, they were able to use DNA
Yes.
to link him to the murders.
They examined the victims' bodies, documented the injuries, figured out the cause of death, which
Right.
was often strangulation, stabbing, or blunt force trauma.
One of the documentaries talked to a forensic anthropologist
Yeah.
who worked on the case,
Mm-hmm.
and he described the really difficult task of excavating the remains,
Right.
often from mass graves.
Yeah, and he talked about how hard it was to identify the victims.
Yeah, because many of them were street children.
Exactly. No documentation,
Well,
no
yeah.
dental records.
Right.
So forensic science was really important in giving them back their names.
Wow, it's like giving a voice to the silenced,
Exactly.
helping to piece together what happened
Yeah,
and bring some justice.
absolutely.
Now, on top of the physical evidence, they also analyzed his handwriting
Yes.
and psychological profile.
They looked at his journals, his writings,
Right.
looking for clues about his personality, his motives.
Trying to get inside the mind of a killer.
Exactly. And they compared his profile to other known serial killers
Okay.
to see how he fit in.
Wow, like building a psychological fingerprint.
Yeah, you could say that.
It really highlights how important forensic science is.
Absolutely crucial in modern investigations.
Yeah, from DNA to psychology.
It gives us these powerful tools to solve crimes and understand this darker side of human nature.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger societal implications of this case, because his crimes really exposed those deep problems in Colombian society.
They did. Poverty, inequality, a culture of violence.
Yeah.
The fact that he could prey on these kids for so long really highlighted the failures.
Of the system.
Exactly. Failures in law enforcement, social services, public awareness.
One of the articles talked about the history and culture
Yeah.
that led to Colombia's high crime rate.
It talked about the legacy of colonialism, the Civil War, the influence of drug cartels.
Right.
It explored machismo and this culture of silence,
Yeah.
where victims were afraid to speak up.
And it made it harder to hold people accountable.
Exactly.
So again, it was this perfect storm
Yeah.
of factors
Yeah.
that allowed this to happen.
Unfortunately, yes.
And Garavito was like a wake-up call.
He was for Colombia.
Right. It forced them to confront these problems.
And we talked about the reforms they made, the laws, the funding for law enforcement, the awareness campaigns.
Yeah.
But are those enough? Have they made a real difference?
They've been a good step.
Okay.
But reform takes time.
Of course.
There's still a lot to do.
To address those underlying issues.
Exactly. Poverty, inequality, violence.
So it's not just about laws. It's about changing attitudes.
Yeah.
Creating a culture that protects everyone.
Especially the most vulnerable.
Okay, so we've talked about Garavito's background, his psychology, the context, the investigation,
Right.
the parole issue, the impact on society.
Yeah.
But I want to circle back to this question of evil.
Okay.
Is it a force outside of us or something we create?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know if we have the answer,
Right.
but I think looking at cases like this can give us some insight.
Okay.
One idea is that evil comes from a lack of empathy.
Okay.
People who can't understand or share the feelings of others
Right.
can inflict pain without remorse.
And that was definitely a key part of Garavito.
It was.
But what causes that lack of empathy?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Is it biological? Is it trauma? Is it something else?
Right. It's probably a mix of things.
Okay.
It's not just one thing that creates a monster.
Right.
It's more complicated than that.
Another idea is that evil is a result of unchecked power.
Yeah, when people have absolute power,
Right.
they're more likely to abuse it.
Yeah, we see that all the time.
We do. Dictators, abusers, power corrupts.
And then there's the idea that evil is a product of how we're raised, social conditioning.
Yeah, societies can make violence seem normal,
Yeah.
dehumanize certain groups,
Right.
and it makes it easier to justify horrible acts.
And that was definitely a factor with Garavito.
It was. The way street children were seen.
Right.
The violence all around.
It created this environment where his crimes were almost tolerated.
Yeah, so it's not just about individual evil, it's
Right.
about the evil in society,
Yeah.
the systems that allow it to happen.
So we have to look at both.
Absolutely. We can't ignore the individual or the context.
Okay, let's talk about justice and accountability. After he was arrested, people wanted him to pay,
They did.
and he got the longest sentence ever.
He did.
But is any punishment enough for what he did?
That's a question people have been asking forever.
Yeah.
Can any punishment really make up for taking a human life?
Right, let alone hundreds of lives.
Yeah, some would say no amount of prison time can make up for the suffering.
And they're right, that loss is immeasurable.
It is.
Others say prison protects society,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't solve the root of the problem.
It doesn't.
One of the documentaries talked to a legal expert
Yeah.
about the different ways we think about punishment.
Yeah. Retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation.
Can you explain those a little more?
Sure, retribution is about punishing someone based on their crime.
Okay.
It's about restoring balance, an eye for an eye.
Okay, so the punishment fits the crime.
Exactly. Deterrence is about preventing future crime
Okay.
by making the consequences outweigh the benefits.
Right, crime doesn't pay.
Exactly.
And what about rehabilitation?
Rehabilitation focuses on helping them change
Okay.
and become productive members of society. It's about addressing those root causes and
Yeah.
giving them the tools to turn their lives around.
So it's about looking forward, not just backward.
Yeah, breaking that cycle of crime.
So for Garavito, which approach makes the most sense?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I mean, his sentence was definitely about retribution and deterrence.
Right.
He got a long time to punish him and to send a message.
Right.
But can someone like him be rehabilitated?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is. Some experts think it's impossible.
Okay.
That he can't feel remorse
Right.
or empathy.
Because of his psychopathy.
Exactly. That he's beyond redemption.
But others say even the worst criminals can change.
Yeah, it's a debate that's not going away anytime soon.
Right.
It shows how complicated the justice system is.
Yeah.
And how hard it is to balance punishment with rehabilitation.
Okay, let's talk about faith and forgiveness.
Okay.
Because it plays a really interesting role in this case.
It does.
Garavito was very religious.
He was a devout Pentecostal.
And he often talked about remorse
Mm-hmm.
and seeking God's forgiveness.
Right.
But he also committed these awful crimes.
It's hard to make sense of it.
Yeah, it's this strange contrast.
It is.
Some people say his faith was real,
Mm-hmm.
but he was fighting this evil inside him.
That classic battle of good versus evil
Yeah.
playing out in one person.
Others think he was using religion to justify his actions.
Yeah, to escape responsibility.
And religion can be used for both.
It can. It can inspire amazing things.
Right.
But it can also be used for terrible things.
Yeah. One article we read talked about forgiveness
Yeah.
in the face of unimaginable evil.
It's a really tough thing to think about.
It is. It's
Isn't it?
especially a challenging concept.
It is. It really is. And that article said that forgiveness isn't about saying what someone did was okay.
Right.
It's about letting go of that anger,
Oh.
the bitterness that can consume you.
So it's not about letting the person who hurt you off the hook,
No,
but about finding a way to heal.
exactly. It's about acknowledging they're human,
Yeah.
but still holding them accountable.
And that article also talked about redemption,
Yeah,
even for someone like Garavito,
it did.
saying that human justice is limited, but divine justice is perfect.
Right.
And even the worst sinner can find forgiveness.
Through God's love.
It's a perspective that offers a little bit of hope
It does.
in the face of all this darkness.
Yeah.
But we can't know for sure if Garavito is really remorseful,
We can't.
or if he wants forgiveness from God, or
Right.
just from himself.
We just don't know.
Okay, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the role of psychology,
Okay.
in trying to understand and prevent these types of crimes.
Yeah.
What have we learned from psychological research?
Psychology has really helped us understand the many factors that can lead to violence.
Okay.
And studies have shown that there's no single cause.
Okay.
It's often a lot of things coming together.
Like a perfect storm.
Yeah, you could say that.
Can you break down those factors for us?
Sure. On the biological side,
Right.
we're looking at things like genes,
Okay.
brain abnormalities, hormones.
Okay.
These are things people are born with
Right.
that can affect their temperament, impulse control, their tendency towards aggression.
And then there's the psychological factors.
Right. Personality disorders, trauma, substance abuse, even just how they think about things.
And those are usually shaped by their experiences.
Yeah, their upbringing, their environment.
Right.
Trauma especially can have a huge impact on the brain
Yeah.
and increase the risk of violence.
And then we can't forget the social factors.
Of course not. Those broader societal issues like poverty,
Right.
inequality, exposure to violence, lack of education, lack of support.
It's like all these things create a breeding ground for crime.
Exactly.
We read a study that talked about the psychology of serial killers
Yeah.
and some common traits they have.
It talked about childhood trauma, mental illness, lack of empathy, fascination with violence, need for power and control, a distorted view of reality.
But not everyone with these traits becomes a killer.
Right. Of course not. These are just risk factors,
Okay.
not guarantees.
So how do we use this research to prevent violence?
It's about early intervention,
Okay.
finding those at risk
Okay.
and giving them the support they need
Right.
to make good choices.
Yeah.
It's about creating a society that supports people,
Okay.
gives them opportunities, promotes well-being.
Breaking the cycle.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to talk about something called restorative justice.
Okay.
I've heard it mentioned with cases like this.
So restorative justice is about shifting the focus away from punishment
Okay.
and towards healing.
Oh,
It's about bringing people together,
okay.
victims, offenders, the community,
Yeah.
to address the harm.
And find a way to move on.
Exactly.
So less about revenge, more about repair.
Exactly. It's acknowledging the harm, holding them accountable, working together to fix things.
And how would that work in a case like Garavito's?
I mean, it would be really tough.
Yeah, of course.
But it could involve bringing the families together,
Yeah.
the community, even Garavito himself,
Wow.
to talk, to try and understand
Okay.
and hold him accountable.
What would that look like?
It could be apologies,
Okay.
restitution, community service,
Right.
sharing stories, expressing their pain,
Yeah.
working on a plan to heal.
But wouldn't that be so hard for the families?
It would be incredibly difficult,
Yeah.
emotionally charged.
Right.
And no one should be forced to do that.
Of course.
But for some, it can bring closure,
Okay.
help them heal.
So it's about forgiveness, not revenge.
You could say that?
But it's hard to imagine in a case like this.
It is. There's so many things to consider.
Yeah.
Will everyone participate?
Right.
Will it cause more trauma?
Right.
Can you even forgive something like this?
We read a report
Yeah.
about using restorative justice in cases of sexual violence.
Right. And that report said it can be good for victims,
Yeah.
help them heal,
Right.
and even reduce the chances of the offender doing it again.
Okay.
But it has to be planned carefully
Right.
with trained people
Huh.
and ways to protect everyone involved.
It's not a quick fix.
It's not.
Okay, let's talk about education.
Okay.
How can we teach kids
Yeah.
and ourselves about these dangers?
Education is key.
Right.
It's about empowering kids with knowledge,
Right.
awareness,
Right.
and the skills to speak up for themselves.
Okay.
We need to teach them about good relationships, boundaries, consent, and when to speak up if something's wrong.
One documentary talked about sex ed in schools.
Yeah, comprehensive sex ed is really important. It's
Yeah.
not just about biology.
Right.
It's about healthy relationships,
Yeah.
consent, respect,
Yeah.
recognizing those red flags.
And what about internet safety?
Oh, absolutely. That's huge these days.
Yeah.
The internet is full of predators.
Yeah.
We need to teach kids how to stay safe online.
And we need to educate ourselves, too.
We do.
Right. About the signs of abuse,
Absolutely.
the tactics predators use,
Yeah.
how to respond if we think a child's being hurt.
We have to be vigilant,
Right.
aware of what's happening around us,
Yeah.
and speak up.
So it's everyone's responsibility
It is.
to create this culture of awareness and prevention.
Exactly. We can't just rely on the police or social workers.
It takes a village.
It really does.
I want to end our conversation on this idea of social responsibility.
Okay.
What does that mean in a case like Garavito's?
You know, his crimes weren't just one man's evil.
Right.
They were made possible because of all these social problems.
The poverty, the inequality.
The violence, the failures of the system.
So you're saying society is partly to blame?
I think we all have a role to play in stopping this from happening again.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
can't just blame him and forget about it.
So what can we do?
We have to address those root causes. Poverty, inequality, discrimination.
Right.
We need to promote education, opportunity.
Create a better society.
Yeah, a culture of peace, respect, empathy.
That's a huge task,
It is.
but it's necessary.
It is. We
Well,
can't just wait for things to change.
Right.
We have to do something.
And it starts with each of us.
It does. Every little bit helps.
Yeah.
We might not solve everything,
Right.
but we can all try to make a difference.
So we're all connected. We're all part of the solution.
Exactly.
Well said. Listener, as we end this deep dive into the Luis Garavito case,
Yeah.
we want to leave you with this thought. What role will you play in creating a world where these things don't happen?
It's a good question.
What can you do to make a difference? Even small things matter.
They do.
Every act of kindness, every effort to help,
Absolutely.
it all makes a difference.
It all adds up.
The fight against evil, the pursuit of justice, it starts with us.
Thank you for joining us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.